I'm so glad to hear that the songs, the messages from the pulpit here really focus back on the main thing and making the main thing the main thing. Because there's a lot of distractions that will come your way. And that's how even happened in my life. When I was in university, I was leading a Bible study group there through the local Christian club on campus. And we had a great time learning all kinds of things. And these people were from different denominations, different backgrounds. They had to learn all kinds of points of view. And I was grateful for the chance to be able to know Jesus speaks through all kinds of people, through all kinds of followers of Jesus, even if it's not the name of my church. But here was my challenge at the Bible study group. I was starting to fall in love with one of the members of the group. And I know a lot of people do that. They meet their spouses often on campus or university. But here was my challenge. The person I was falling in love with was someone in a men's Bible study group that I was leading. And I didn't know what to do with those same-sex sexual attractions. And so I went to a Christian counselor, and he gave me something that I still remember that challenged me. As I struggled and shared my heart, how broken I was, how I'm committed to following Jesus, but now I'm struggling with these attractions that I don't know what to do with, and the whole culture now is saying that I just ought to act on them. This is what he said. He said, at the end of the day, sexual attractions are things that you have. They are not things that you are, unless you choose them to be. In other words, at the end of the day, all of the people talking, sharing what their new sexual identity is, their gender identity is, are just expressing their heart. The problem is they have an identity. They've built their identity around how they feel. And my counselor was reminding me, actually, we have as Christians a better form or better foundation for our identity. In fact, if you look at the word identity, and when you see how it's defined in the dictionary, it's defined as the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. And if you think about that describes many traits that we all have, doesn't it? And we have all kinds of traits that can define who we are. For example, I would hope most of us would want to identify with our faith, with Christ. We identify with our religious or moral views. That's who we are. Our Christian faith defines us. But that's not the only thing. We can also be defined by things like our physical characteristics. Here's a picture from a redhead convention in Ireland. And they actually have all kinds of activities, and they have all kinds of plans, and it's pretty awesome for redheads, right? That's their identity. You can also identify based on the things that you like to do, right? Some people like gardening. Some people like winter. I don't know why, but some people do. They like all kinds of winter sports. Or this gentleman here, he says, she wanted a puppy, I didn't, so we compromised and got a puppy. Right? So you can be a dog person or not so much a dog person, or be married to one. That can be an identity too. You can even identify with the kinds of activities you want to cheer for. So here's a picture of a gentleman who says, when the Leafs win the cup, I'll marry my girlfriend. I heard she's a nun now, actually, sadly. I don't know, actually they're happily married now. I found out them through social media. But that could be your identity too, right? The team you cheer for. And so we have to recognize that people nowadays, especially young people, have chosen sexuality or gender to be the core of their identity. And let me explain. In fact, the study done just last year, a year and a half ago, by Newsweek, found that 40% of Generation Z, that's around 25 and under, now identify as LGBTQ. 30% of church-going kids identify as LGBTQ. And what's important, and I've alluded to this several times here, I want you to understand, I'm not saying your sexual attractions or your gender identity is a choice in terms of what you choose your feelings. I don't choose my attractions. That's the reason why I went to my counselor. I didn't choose this. But if you look at these different traits that we just talked about, isn't it obvious some of these traits are more important than others? Right? You can change your hair color. Right? You can move to a different town and hopefully stop cheering for the Toronto Maple Leafs. right? You can do all kinds of things with these identities. Some are more important than others. And that's the point that we need to understand. We may not choose our attractions, but we choose our identity. We choose what we prioritize to define us. And so this is an attack on any group. This is not a thing that I'm saying against any person or any kind of identity. All I'm saying is, if we're honest, we choose our identity, don't we? We choose what is most important about us. And what's beautiful is the Christian story actually offers a better identity. It actually offers a way to see ourselves in contrast to how the culture views us. So in just a few seconds here, I'm going to ask them to play a passage from Luke chapter 7. If you want to follow along, you're welcome to do so. Luke chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. This video is merely someone's interpretation. The text that's being read is actually just the verses from the Bible. So you can just follow along. And it is an interpretation. So it's not all the way that they've dramatized it. It isn't all biblical. But I like showing this because it puts us in the situation that happens here, where Jesus comes into the house of Simon the Pharisee, who's hostile to him, and a woman comes to wash his feet. And I think there's three key illustrations here of how Jesus actually describes or shows how we can shape or choose our identity.
When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town, who lived a sinful life, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss. But this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet." Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace."
Go in peace. When we look at this story, and it's not always obvious as we look at it, but clearly here's a message on identity. Because we can see three ways we can choose an identity. First, we can choose our identity based on how you feel about yourself. Just think about it. When you look at this woman, How do you think she feels about herself? What's her thought process? How does she value herself? She's washing people's feet with her hair. Ladies, would you do that? Just think about this too. Back then, it was the job of the lowliest servant to wash people's feet as they entered the house. How many of you have been to Jerusalem or Israel before? Great, it's beautiful, isn't it? And we just need to keep praying for the peace of that country, for everybody there. But if you've been to Jerusalem before, you know it's close to a desert. It's a fairly dusty town. And not only that, hundreds of animals would have walked through the streets of Jerusalem at that time. And so what do you think they'd be leaving behind as they walk by? Right? And people would walk through this dust and guck, and they wouldn't be having beautiful boots like we do. They have open-toed sandals. And so when they come into someone's house, the first thing that people would want is to have their feet washed so they don't bring all that stuff inside the church. And Jesus in the story points out that Simon the Pharisee, his host, is not even respectful enough to make sure that there's a servant to wash his feet. In contrast, the woman sees the value of what Jesus is and who he is so much that she's willing to wash his feet with her hair and her tears. See, she understood what people thought of her, and she's internalized it, I think. Because when Simon calls her a sinner and calls her all these names, the implication from most theologians is that she's a sexual sinner. She's someone who's out there, someone we don't have to interact with, someone who's untouchable. And that's what she thought of herself. And the sad thing is so many of us now trust our feelings to determine how we view our value or view ourselves. But can we always trust how we feel? Have your feelings sometimes ever lied to you? Like at midnight, and you wake up and you realize there's a fourth slice of chocolate cake in the fridge, and you really want it. Now, do you think that's a good thing for you? Probably not, right? I know it's not for me. And that's what I mean. Your feelings aren't always reliable. They can't always tell you the truth. In fact, about 10 years ago, you remember the biggest issue for young people was eating disorders, like anorexia nervosa, where young people, particularly young girls, would look at themselves in the mirror and see someone large and obese when they were just skin and bones. Have you remember all that? And what was the treatment for that? Was it to fix the body? Which wasn't the problem at all. What was the problem? The mind. And so when there's a disconnect between someone's body and someone's mind, what's the cure to treat this? Does that sound like any gender ideas that we're having today? That somehow our body can't tell us what we are. We have to determine it by how we feel instead in our mind. Because when we start thinking that way, the challenge we have is that we can have no sure foundation when our feelings, which change all the time, becomes the foundation for our identity. I remember I was talking to a friend of mine who worked at the Boys and Girls Club. And at the Boys and Girls Club, he worked with 13 young people, about 13 years old or so. And he said half of them claimed to be transgender. He said one young lady, she actually wore a bracelet that she could flip the top of to indicate what her gender identity was at the moment. And in a span of 4 hours, she changed her gender identity 5 times. Does that sound like a sure foundation for identity? Yeah, we're not trying to hate this young lady. She's a beautiful young lady, but that's the problem. If you love her, do you think that's the best way for her to choose her identity? How she feels. Take a look at this. Here are some of the gender identities that people can now decide that they are. And when I point this out, often young people ask me, well, what does agender mean, or third gender, or agender version 1, or transvesti NB? And my response is, I have no idea. Because frankly, neither do they. I was at the largest gay Christian conference in Chicago in 2019, about 2,500 people or so, and me. I wasn't there to argue, I was there to listen. And every time they want to invite people, they welcome them, like ladies and gentlemen, right? That kind of stuff. But because of all these gender identities, they have to add all those other gender identities as part of their welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and trans, and bi, and all these other things. And then they would often say something like, and everybody else, because we can't remember all the identities. They themselves don't know. Because if you think about it, all but two of these identities are shaped solely by how you feel at the moment. The only two, male and female, they're based on your biology. They don't change regardless of how you feel. And this is what I'm trying to say. We're not trying to hate on anyone. We're saying, does that sound like a stable identity to you based on how you feel? Here's the other challenge. If feelings determine our gender, why stop at gender? Meet Rachel Dolezal. This is what she looked like in her late teens, early 20s, until she started identifying as a black woman. Why did she identify as a black woman? Because as a child, she used to use black crayons to draw herself. Now, is that how we determine race? How you feel? She was actually the head of the NAACP in Seattle, the local African American group, until the group members realized she's not actually black. And this is the issue. She can argue this. She makes the same exact argument about being transracial as being transgender, because feelings determine her identity. Or how about this guy? This one's Canadian. Meet Paul Walsh, some of his kids, his wife, devout Catholic from the GTA, from Toronto. Until Paul, who was about 56, 60 years old, began to identify as a 7-year-old girl. So not only as a female, as a 7-year-old girl. Why? Because he said he never had a childhood and wants to relive that childhood. Was adopted by a family with an 8-year-old girl, and the reason why he's 7 is because the 8-year-old wanted to be the older sister. The trans community is actually embarrassed by him. But he's using the same arguments to justify being trans-aged as people use for being transgender. Why? Because it's based on how he feels. You see the problem? If feelings determine identity, if our personal feelings determine identity, there's no stopping where those feelings go. And here's the best part. There's something better and more trustworthy than our feelings to create an identity. It's because Jesus sees how this woman sees her identity. He offers her something better. Second way that we can identify is based on how other people see you. Based on how other people see you. When you think about Simon the Pharisee, when he looks at this woman, what's his first thought? If Jesus was truly this good teacher, he would know that this woman is untouchable. Are you familiar with the caste system in India? You know that? Where people of the lowest caste, and these people will be the ones who are janitors and taking out the dead. If they touch someone of the higher caste person would be made unclean. They have to do ritual washing. In fact, in some cases, when the shadow of someone of a lower caste were to fall on someone of a higher caste, that shadow would be enough to make this person unclean. That's what Simon's thinking here. This woman is so sinful that she's so unclean, her presence is making everybody else unclean. Their touching is making everyone else unclean. And she wasn't just touching Jesus, she was washing him with her hair and her tears. And so clearly this whole culture viewed her as a sinner, and most theologians, as I mentioned, talk about how this is so extreme, it's probably most likely a sexual sin that she's known for. That's her entire identity in this culture. Sound familiar? And this is what's, I think, so key for us, that at the end of the day, when we think about sexuality, we have to recognize it's a social construct, which in academia means it's created by society. Do you know that? And this isn't my statement as a Christian speaker or apologist or theologian. This is actually something non-Christian, pro-LGBT historians talk about. So meet Hannah Blank. She's not a Christian. She's an ally, in fact, of the LGBTQ community. And she actually wrote a book called Straight, The Surprisingly Short History of Heterosexuality. Now, of course, if heterosexuality has a short history, guess what? So does homosexuality. And what she's arguing here, let me be clear, is not that homosexual practice is new. Of course, it's been around for a long time. It's mentioned in the Bible. What she's arguing is that the identity of sexuality, that you define yourself by your sexual feelings or gender feelings, and that defines who you are, that's a modern construct. In fact, you know the word heterosexual prior to the 1860s referenced people, described people who were actually promiscuous with the opposite sex. It did not mean a straight person who was only attracted to the opposite sex. Take a listen to what she said, if we could get that video.
Heterosexuality is so new. The idea of the heterosexual is only as old as the typewriter, the traffic light, and dynamite. They all changed our culture in huge ways, and so did heterosexuality. It's an Austro-Hungarian journalist named Karl Maria Kertbeny who had a friend who committed suicide as a result of being blackmailed for his same-sex desires. And Kertbeny made the assertion, why should it be illegal for two people who happen to be of the same biological sex to engage in behavior that is not illegal for a couple where the members of the couple are of different biological sexes? And part of his fight against this law was pamphleteering and letter writing and correspondence to try and change the minds of people who were influential. And it was in the course of this correspondence that he coined both terms, heterosexual and homosexual, and he coined those terms simultaneously. And the reason that he coined those terms was because he wanted a way of explaining human sexuality and human sexual desire in a way that was not hierarchical, that did not create an order of sexuality in which one sexuality was necessarily better or higher or more natural or in some way superior to the other.
Again, please understand what she's saying. She's not saying homosexual practices are new, but the whole concept that we have to pigeonhole every person, every child, and give them a label based on their sexual or gender identity or feelings, that's completely new. And we don't have to do that. In fact, Jesus doesn't do that in this story. And that was one of the most liberating things for me as someone who struggles with this, to realize I'm not defined by my struggle. That is not what I have to be. That's not what I have to label myself. Because God gives something so much better, and my identity is not based on how other people view me or think about me. There's something better. In fact, you know what happened when Hannah has talked about this, and I can't prove causation, but there's definitely correlation here. When people began to adopt this idea that you can label yourself based on your sexuality, based on who you're wanting to sleep with at the moment, I think it radically changed Western culture. Let me illustrate. Here's a picture of a men's basketball team from 1915. Now, they're chest to back. They're actually touching each other, gentlemen, on a picture. And think about it. Would your hockey team ever pose this way? If you suggest that. Okay, probably not, right? Less than 30 years later, as this concept becomes more popular, look at a men's basketball team then. See anything different? Why did that change happen so quickly? Because I think what happened was men did not want to be labeled gay, and so they stopped acting this way and showing public affection. Now, in some other parts of the world, this isn't the case because this idea didn't reach them, and it was something that was foreign to their culture. I had a friend, I think he was in Kenya, he was doing missionary work there, and my friend is like a big buff guy. He does those Highland games, you know, the Scottish guys they throw big rocks and the logs and stuff while wearing a nice kilt, right? Well, he actually was doing work there, and they were just finishing for the day. They got onto the bus, got on the bus home. He was sitting beside the pastor. The pastor got a phone call, and as the pastor's talking on the phone, he looks around, and he takes his other hand and starts rubbing my friend's thigh up and down like this. And my buddy is like, what is going on? This is not normal. This is not good. And then he realizes, look around the bus, and all the other guys are doing the same thing with their friends. And there was not one hint at all that it was sexual. They could show public affection with other men. There was no idea that it was sexual. Why? Because this concept that we have to label people based on their sexuality, it's something that's foreign. They don't talk about that. And yet right now we're indoctrinating young people and telling them the only way for you to identify, the most important way to identify is based on your sexuality and your gender. You see how much of an idolatry this is? That's not with God. That's not how God sees it. And we have to acknowledge something as well. As the church, too many times we've actually labeled people the same way. And that's why the gay community, when they see messages like this, have formed their community, created an identity just around their sexuality or their transgender identity, and they hate everybody, or they want to make sure everybody else accepts their identity. Because by accepting their identity, we can accept them. And they don't realize, no, we are much more than just our sexuality. We're much more than just this. Our identity is so much bigger and so much better. The part of the challenge we have now is that we live in a culture where feelings determine facts, where how we feel determines how we are or what we are. I actually asked 5 of my LGBTQ friends, I asked them, what role do you think biology should play in determining our identity, especially our gender? And they said, 3 of the 5 said none at all. Biology should have no role in playing in how you determine your gender? Oh, just think about that. So what does? How you feel. And that's why if you go online right now, you can actually buy a t-shirt that says there are more than 2 genders. Now here's the problem. Do we live every day as if feelings determine facts? Should we live that way? My cousins and I were playing at their house, my aunt's house, when we were kids. They were roughhousing, horsing around. And suddenly we heard this thud and a crack. And it was one of my aunt's favorite plants had dropped to the floor. And all the soil and the leaves were ripped apart. And of course, as soon as that noise was heard, guess who comes running into the living room? My aunt. And she looks around, she looks at her plant. What do you think her first question was? Who did it? Exactly. And what do you think our response was? Not me. Exactly. Why was that our first response? Why would we say that? Because we knew she was angry, right? That's how she felt. And she would be angry at the person who knocked it over. That's the fact. You see that? Her feelings follow the facts, not the other way around. And that's all we need to ask people. It's not that your feelings don't matter. Of course they do. But shouldn't your feelings be based on facts? Shouldn't facts determine feelings? In fact, if you want to go buy that t-shirt that says there are more than 2 genders, and you're welcome to do it. You can find it on Amazon. You'll realize instantly it only comes in male and female sizes. Why? Because the person who's making this statement may feel this way, but she can't erase the facts. That's the point. And that's why we need something more stable than our feelings to identify with. We need something more stable than our feelings to identify. And this is the beauty of this story. When you look at what Jesus says to this woman, he's actually showing her that you can base your identity, not on how you feel, not how other people feel about you, but based on how God feels about you. Now, take a look at what he says at the end there, what Jesus says to this woman at the end. Does he ignore her sin? Does he just say, okay, don't worry, you can do whatever you want? No, how do we know that? What does he do to help her understand that he's not ignoring the sin? He forgives her, doesn't he? He acknowledges that there's sin there. The woman acknowledges there's sin there. And not only that, he forgives her sin. And in forgiving her sin, he actually does something really critical. He gives her a brand new identity. Say, it doesn't matter how you feel about yourself. It doesn't matter what other people think about you or how other people define you. What matters is how I define you. And I define you as a forgiven child of God. See, at the end of the day, I know many of you may have friends or family. You may not even agree with this message. That's okay. But I want you to think about this. And this is the critical question here. Who knows us best? Who understands how we ought to function best? Who is the one who loves us best, despite everything we've done wrong? There's a great Tumblr account. It was a social media account. A young man said, look, I know I'm all these awful things. What I really want is for someone to know me as I am and still love me anyway. Who is the one who can do that? It's only Jesus. And that's why we ought to think about, as Christians, who do we use to define our identity? Who do we use to define our children's identity? Shouldn't we trust the one who loves us best? The Apostle John, actually, remember, has my favorite description of himself, my favorite identity in Scripture. Do you remember what he called himself in the Gospel of John? What was his favorite title for himself? The disciple, remember, that Jesus loved. And what's critical about that, think about it, is in a culture that says we are defined by who we love, the Apostle John instead says, we are defined by who loves us. And I want to leave that challenge with you. I want you to think about that. I know this is a controversial topic, it's a difficult one, and I'm so glad for the leadership of this church to be willing to take leadership on this issue. Because I want us to be encouraged to understand, as someone standing here in front of you who still struggles with this, I want to tell you the gospel is the best identity.